Wow, that's a great introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. There we go. I'm looking at this clock. It says 2 o'clock, and I have 45 minutes. So it's good because there's a clock right up here that I am going to completely ignore. For those who, if you don't know my background, I grew up Southern Baptist, and it takes us about 35 minutes just to introduce ourselves. I'm going to try to abbreviate that today. I'm really glad to be here with all of you. It is a very serious moment, and I want to talk about this moment in some significant ways. I want to talk about what I think this moment is. I want to talk about how we got here. And I want to talk about the implications if we are unable as progressive activists, organizers, and leaders to find our way out of this moment. With that said, before we jump into this time, I'm going to just do 3 things for folks because I feel like it makes the 45 minutes go much more quickly. So the first thing is I'm just going to have everyone take a look at the person next to you. Just, you don't have to give them deep gaze, but don't make them uncomfortable. But just acknowledge the person next to you. And I think it's important to kind of recognize the humanity that's in this room, that we are here together. The second is, if you have a cell phone, can you take it out? Can you take your cell phone out? It's okay. The reason I want you to take it out is I'd much rather have you have it in your hand, looking at it, than distracted and wanting to look at it while I'm speaking. So I am a 2018 kid, meaning if you feel the need to check your email, your social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., feel free. I would just ask that occasionally maybe you might mention me, or I'm there, or peace and justice action. So thank you. The third is I just want to take a moment to just recognize the Spokane Nation and the land that we are on today, and just to recognize their Constitution was passed in 1851, and those of us from Western State Center, the staff and board, please know that we remain committed to ensuring that local state government continue and strengthen their abilities to partner with these sovereign nations and to strengthen tribal sovereignty. It's critically important, and I want to thank you for maintaining your language, your culture on your land, and understanding that we are visitors here, and we thank you for allowing us to be here and speak here today. It's an amazing time, and I'm going to switch back and forth because I haven't decided where I want my notes. I was going left to right, right to left, and it reminds me of this story. Every year, they take a picture out in front of the Supreme Court, and it is a photo of all the justices. Has anyone ever seen that? Raise your hand if you've seen this photo. So they take it every year, and they line them out in front of, on the steps of the Supreme Court, and they take this photo. And one year, a photographer was there, and I was walking by, and they were taking this photo. And the photographer glanced up and said, "Lean a little bit to the right," and they all fell over. That didn't really happen. But it does symbolize the moment that we are in right now. It is a time where the existential fight is between the power of exclusion versus the power of inclusion. And by inclusion, I mean people-centered, accountable, and transparent government. In my time here in the Pacific Northwest in the 80s and 90s, we often talked about hate groups and hate movements. In fact, the Pacific Northwest and Mountain States regions is the only region in this country that has actually successfully beat the white nationalist movement or these hate group phenomena, and I'll come back to why I think that is. But at the time, we talked about it as the spreading of hate. It is only now that I understand that these hate groups weren't seeking simply to spread hate, that they were merely using hate to build political power to seize the state. We flash forward to 2018, and white nationalism has emerged as the predominant social movement in America today. For progressives, that is hard for us to understand. And today I want to talk about how we got to this moment. So I go back to the Supreme Court imagery to specifically talk about the idea that as progressives, we need to dispense with the myth that politics swing from the left to the right, as if they function on a pendulum in American society. That the idea that things sometimes swing out of sort, but we will balance out, is a completely false myth. If it is true that the politics of America swing on a pendulum, then we over the last 40 years have found ourselves in a position where the fulcrum of the pendulum is being shoved to the right, being shoved in such a way that each successive switch or shift to the left brings us nowhere near where the society used to be. I think about Richard Nixon, that bright, shining, progressive president. Richard Nixon, that was a joke too. Sometimes I find I have to clarify those jokes. Richard Nixon, who put forth one of the most progressive, right, healthcare proposals that this nation has ever seen. As we now argue and mobilize, spending millions of countless activist dollars and energy and resources to debate immigration reform in this country, healthcare reform in this country, trying to preserve some limited access for the most vulnerable amongst us, we forget that there was a time in the not too distant past where the debate was actually focused on whether we should have universal health care or not in this country. How much space have we lost over the last 40 years? It is an incredible moment to watch the election of Donald Trump. I think of this moment, and I remember election night, watching the returns come in. I was an individual who actually thought, I'm a little bit of a pessimist somewhere buried deep inside of me, and I had a fear since the primaries that Donald Trump would be the President of the United States. It was based off the idea that during the primaries, people were much more willing to cast their votes for Donald Trump in secret than in public. Open primaries versus closed primaries proved that over and over. The straw poll was much more hard for Donald Trump to win than a normal primary vote. It signaled for me a shift in this country, and one of an existential nature. Donald Trump had built a coalition around him of old industry, of white nationalists who had built a coalition called alt-right, of theocrats who wanted to dispense with democracy and replace it by centering their idea of what Christianity looks like, and those who were just afraid of the changes that were occurring in this country. The Democratic Party did not seem prepared for this moment, but neither did progressive organizations and movements. We still thought we were fighting the same old fights. We saw Donald Trump and the movement that he was building around him as just merely one of another countless incidences of systemic bigotry that this society has struggled with for decades. What I want to argue with you today is that it was something completely different going on. And when we ask the question about how did we get into this moment, in all honesty, as a progressive speaking to other progressives, we must first start by looking in the mirror. The truth of the matter is that Donald Trump became president of the United States because we as a progressive movement have not let go of our ability to continue to build ourselves into a subculture that is more focused on proper language and proper behavior amongst one another than the power building that needs to occur to counter this existential crisis. So let's start in the beginning. In the beginning doesn't start in 2017 or even 2016, but immediately following the civil rights movement of the 1960s. We don't like to talk about the civil rights movement. It's not very sexy anymore and not very enticing. And in fact, some of my friends who were active in policing talked about it as themselves, compared to the 1960s, as not their grandparents' civil rights movement, right? And that is a shift in generation, which is important, but I think it is also important to revisit. In 1964, the civil rights movement was at its peak. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference had formed in response to the events that occurred in Montgomery around the bus boycott. And what we forget often is that this was about organization and the building of power. People remember, raise your hands if you remember a name called Rosa Parks. Someone named Rosa Parks, right? Yeah, people have heard of her. Okay, good. Now, the story I was taught in school might be similar to the story that was taught to you. That one day, Rosa Parks was tired. One day. And so tired on that one day that she refused to give up her seat on a city bus. And because she didn't give up her seat to a white person that one day, police came, arrested her, right, and put her in jail. And the next day, and for over 364 days afterwards, all of a sudden the entire black community, right, stayed off the buses, right? And we got so organized within like 8 hours that we had shuttle services, right? We had like organizers, we had field teams, schedulers, we had door knockers, all in 8 hours in Montgomery, Alabama. It is a testament to progressive organizing, right? That was the story. And when I was told that story in school in 5th or 6th grade, and I'm sure my parents told me earlier, but I don't think they told me in that way. When I heard that story, something seemed wrong about that. It didn't seem right? There had to be a little bit more to it. And we now know, this is not new to folks in the audience, but we know that that's not quite how things played out. Rosa Parks was a long-term veteran organizer and community leader. Rosa Parks was the secretary of the NAACP. Rosa Parks had spent over a decade organizing in her community to counter the abuse of women. Rosa Parks was well known and well respected, but more importantly, Rosa Parks was part of organization. And so much part of organization that before the arrest of Rosa Parks, they had all been over at a place called the Highlander Center for Research and Education in Tennessee, where they actually were strategizing around how they could confront segregation, right, in Montgomery, Alabama. And could it be used to build a larger campaign around the nation, right, to address segregation and the dispowerment of black folks? So I often say it's important to remember Rosa Parks was not the first person to be arrested, right? She was not the first woman to be arrested for not giving up her seat. It was that at the moment she was arrested, the conditions were ripe for organizing. And when the conditions became ripe, the infrastructure, leadership, and experience was there to change the lives of people forever. We often say not much has changed since the civil rights movement, but actually much has changed. I don't wax poetic on what has changed to ignore the huge disparities that still exist around race and economy in this society. But I do encourage us to recognize the victories that we have had as progressive and rights movements. We must stop being the Eeyores of social movements. Progressives, radicals do not like to celebrate our victories, nor do we allow others to celebrate those victories, nor do we acknowledge the nuance of change in this society. The fact of the matter is that the civil rights movement in this country destroyed the concept of white supremacy as the rule of law in this country. It was significant. Now, it doesn't mean white supremacy does not still function as a system of disparities, both historical and present day. What it means is that it is no longer the rule of law. It was a significant victory that was won on the blood of people and on their marching feet and their sophistication and dedication. And it changed how this country functions forever. Well, no good loss goes without a reaction. And if you think of white supremacy as being challenged and defeated, imagine what a segregationist might think. So if white supremacy is a system of exploitation that exploited black people's labors, stole the lands and resources of Native people largely through genocide, controlled women's reproduction, convinced working white folks that their lots were better off with the elites than other folks who lived life like them. And this system of white supremacy was existent. It was the rule of the law, the land, and then it changed. So imagine being that arch segregationist. What do you say? you believe that black folks are inferior, right? That you are the most superior person on the planet. How do you explain a loss to folks who you see as inferior? How do you grasp that? So what happens is that segregationists have to come up with a reason. And if you think that's far-fetched, just think about this. Think about the last time you failed a test. Think about the last time something didn't go your way. Think about the last time you didn't get the president you wanted. How much time did you spend trying to understand what happened? And I suspect most people constructed some type of answer. And these segregationists were no different. They needed to explain what happened. So they convinced themselves of a worldview combined from old things that were in Europe and elsewhere. But the way that they explain this loss and then subsequent losses of rights as women, LGBTQ folks began to expand rights, segregationists saw it as a loss of rights. And the way that they explained it was that there must have been a conspiracy at work, because there's no way women, immigrants, black folks, poor working class white folks could be smart enough to outwit them. So what became the reason? And the reason became anti-Semitic. They convinced themselves that there was a supernatural force at work, and that the supernatural force was the Jew. And that the supernatural force sought to take away the rights of white Americans and to make them slaves. And that every push for inclusion in the society of those who were formerly dispossessed began to prove this idea to these segregationists. It is in actually the ashes of white supremacy that white nationalism begins to rise in the United States in the 1960s. If white supremacy is a system of discrimination, white nationalism is a social movement. It is a social movement that is not committed to the old, but committed to constructing a society that is free of people of color and Jews altogether. Its goal is to build a white-only ethno-state. Let me repeat this again. If white supremacy is a system that seeks to exploit people of color, white nationalism is a social movement that seeks power to rid this country of people of color altogether. These are two different phenomena. And to treat them as the same thing is to treat a cow and a Big Mac as the same thing, because they are both made of beef. You do not call a veterinarian when you drop your Big Mac, right? Or if you do, we should talk. The response in this moment means that we have to begin to retool as progressives. What we have done over the last year is to treat these two phenomena as the same thing. We create debates that rage across social media about how one issue is more important than the other, as if we had a choice. We do this because we fundamentally, deep inside, don't believe that something has fundamentally changed in America. We believe that we are still dancing to the same tune. It is an arrogance amongst progressive and left organizations, and it is an arrogance that is killing us and killing our society. What we have to understand is that the role before us is to deal with the systemic disparities that exist in our society And we must figure out how to manage and push back against this white nationalist movement that seeks power. If you believe that it is not committed to that, I just encourage you to look at some of the people who've been expelled from the Trump administration and those who still reside there. I encourage you to look at the streets of Charlottesville, Seattle, Berkeley, and Portland. The white nationalist movement is a social movement. Not all social movements come from the left or from progressive causes. It is arrogant to think we are the only social movement of relevance on the political terrain of America. It is arrogant to believe that all social movements are inclusive and seek to better society. History does not prove that out, and neither does our experience here in the Pacific Northwest in the Mountain State region. The truth is that social movements build and grow, and they seek influence. And if we do not respond, if we treat them as aberrations, we merely give them the air and oxygen they need to grow. So my point is, if you remember nothing else, we should stop thinking of this as a two-way fight. Us simply trying to hold government accountable. Us simply trying to hold corporations accountable. And to understand that we now sit in the midst of a three-way fight where corporations, white nationalists, and those of us who believe in an inclusive America are fighting to control the infrastructure of government. We are seeking ways to bring our values to the forefront. And if we do not win this fight, I believe that hate crimes will increase, the draconian enforcement being leveled against immigrants and refugees will increase, the expansive growing inequality of wealth in this country will continue to occur. It is our moment to step up. How did we get here? We got here in some three very specific ways. The first had to do with demographic change. Anyone ever hear the term the browning of America? Right? We mostly talk about demographic change. We use it as an argument or a moral imperative about why we should address racism and other forms of disparity, about why there should be multilingual access. But not everyone does. And with demographic growth also comes demographic anxiety. I remember back in it must have been 1999, there was this thing called Y2K. People remember Y2K? We'll talk later. For those who don't remember Y2K, Y2K was this thing where because of a computer chip problem, right, everything was going to shut down. I'm not going to go into details about it. You can corner me later. But everything was going to shut down. We weren't going to be able to use the banks, and power grids were going to go off, and calamity, basically Cloverfield monster, right? And people did a lot of hoarding of food, which is, for emergencies is not a bad thing, but maybe people may have gone a little overboard. And it was also in the midst of the regrowth of the white nationalist movement in the Pacific Northwest. So in December, I got a call from a weekly paper that was doing a thing on Y2K in 2000 because people wanted to know what were these hate groups going to do on New Year's Eve, right? And they wanted to know, what we thought they were going to be doing. Were they going to be committing violence? What would they do? And my response was, they won't be doing much. They'll probably be doing what I'm going to be doing, which is popping popcorn and watching Lawrence Welk. I didn't do either of those on New Year's Eve. But the reason I said that was that the white nationalist movement was never really talking about Y2K. What they were always talking about was 2050. And the reason why they were talking about 2050 and not the year 2000 is that they were talking about demographic change in America. And they were looking at the separatist movement in Quebec. They were looking at the French National Front in France. Now remember, this is 2000, right? They're looking at Germany. They're looking at places like Fiji. They're looking in the Middle East. And everywhere they're looking, they see that religious, racial, and ethnic nationalism is on the rise. And they thought to themselves, if it could happen there, why not here? They looked at a place that used to be called Yugoslavia, as it was breaking up along religious and ethnic lines, and they thought to themselves, why not here? And the truth is that they began to develop a strategy, right, to exploit what they knew was a growing anxiety around demographic change. And it's not just an anxiety built off of unfounded fears, right? Demographics play a role for all of us. But they figured out how to really use it. And I'm going to give you an example. I want everyone to close their eyes for a second, because I may have bored you and put you to sleep by now. So close your eyes, and I'm going to give you a word. And when you hear the word, I want you to kind of imagine what it looks like, what it sounds like. Immigration. And if you're with me, you can still come back. So the truth of the matter is, when we are being honest with ourselves as Americans, when we hear the word immigration, we are not visualizing Canadians coming down from the north. What we are visualizing are brown-skinned people coming up from the south. And the media reinforces that every time there is a conversation on immigration in this country. What the white nationalist movement figured out is that they could have a debate on race without ever using the word race. They merely had to deploy terms like crime, immigration, and welfare. In that they could trust that those of us on the progressive side of the aisle were so uncomfortable about talking about race that we would actually try to debate policy with them. And because policy is about compromise, every time we had that debate, they could pull us a little bit further to the right. Us always seeking to have a compromise, they having a national debate around who is an American and what would America look like. It is how we have gone from Ronald Reagan launching the largest, right, legalization policy in this country to debating whether we should deport 200,000 or 500,000 people, young people, single mothers, through draconian means. We have been pulled so far off center that we have forgotten that as progressives, that our values demand a society where everyone gets to live, love, and work free from fear and bigotry. And that we are unapologetic about those values. They have pulled us so off course in terms of anxiety, in our inability to lean into this conversation on race, that we no longer know how to frame our vision of who is an American and what will America look like. But it wasn't just demographic anxiety. The second was globalization and the economic restructuring that was happening in American society. Now, granted, it was happening to some communities much longer than it was happening to others. It was also happening globally and had been happening globally for a long time. But the disparity of wealth in this country has grown to such a point, right, that now international human rights rapporteurs are being dispatched to the United States to document the rights abuses that are occurring from these economic disparities. We have seen the largest shift in wealth to occur in the modern age, both in the United States and outside the United States. This has created a condition within white America that most of us as progressives ignore. The fact that folks who saw themselves as economically stable are now struggling, like the rest of us, to hold on. We may not think much of that, and sometimes cynically we say, welcome to the family, join the club. But the fact of the matter is that it's disabling. And morally, we shouldn't wish these conditions upon anyone. It has created such conditions that the rates of suicides amongst white farmers are now some of the highest suicide rates in the nation as people lose their lands. This is a real phenomenon, and it doesn't just impact white folks, but it impacts all of us. It is within that space of economic restructuring that has fueled a constituency that is looking for some kind of answer. And when that answer can be fused with racism and bigotry, they will drink it up like Kool-Aid. The third is the siloing of our own movements. So if demographic anxiety and economic dislocation is a problem, so is the fact that as the progressive movement, we have siloed ourselves over and over throughout the years. And when I talk about the siloing of our movements, what I mean by this is that we are unable to pivot from issue to issue or opportunity to opportunity. We demand such a strict, right, set of conditions to work with one another that we effectively are no longer able to build mass-based organizations in this country. We demand such a perfection that we have become nothing more than a subculture. We have become a subculture in America that has lots of impact on one another as a self-empowerment tool, very good. But in terms of building the political, economic, and social power necessary to meet this moment, completely ineffective. This siloing has allowed the right to recruit constituencies without any competition, to set policies with little response. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't think progressive movements and radical movements have not been alienated and persecuted in American society. What I'm saying is that we have also created the conditions that have allowed this moment to happen. If people are looking for an anchor in this moment, I have to ask myself, when I look into the mirror, are we the anchor that is likely to draw people to us? Are we the space that can handle hundreds or thousands of people coming through the doors? How do we welcome people who are not on the same page as us, but who don't want to choose white nationalism as the response? Because what we know is that our subculture goes to bed every night dreaming, praying, meditating that Donald Trump will be impeached. I'm not going to lie. That's what everyone thinks when they close their eyes. And when you turn on the news, that's what you hope you see. Because deep down inside, you have not accepted that this is a new moment in America. Deep down inside, you think this is an aberration, and that if they would just impeach George Bush, everything could go back to normal. But what existed before wasn't normal. And it was not normal for most of Americans. It was not a good life. The best thing about Donald Trump, if we survive Donald Trump, is that everything has now changed. The genie is out the bottle. And old ideas, old tools are insufficient to building the base we need to move forward in inclusive America. At the end of the day, what we have to understand is that it's time for us to step up. It is time for us to be complex and nuanced. If you must be a subculture, then at least try to be a counterculture. One that challenges narrative, one that challenges power, not one that maintains a small worldview that is cut off from the rest of Americans. The role before us, and believe me, I have there's nothing bad about monasteries and convents and monks. But that is not why we built a progressive movement in this country. We didn't build it to be a comfortable social space, but a space that built power to represent the aspirations of Americans who are being stepped upon. Stepped upon because they're trans, stepped upon because they're homeless, because they are a person of color, because they are Native, because they are a single mom, because they must hold 4 jobs to keep a roof over their heads. Someone must speak for these folks. And it is the job ahead of us. So I want to talk about next, in these last 5 minutes, what do we do? In this moment moving ahead, I want to encourage people to take on 3 tasks. So the first is to first understand the difference between voice and voice, right? You can write that down. What does that mean, Eric? I'm up here speaking to you today. This is a voice. I'll give you that. When the mayor speaks in his meeting, he can close a meeting down or open it up. That's the difference between voice and voice. It's time for us to recognize that we have to stop talking to one another in ways that don't build power. It is time for us to build tangible power that is competitive to the other forces operating in society. We should constantly be asking ourselves, is what my organization doing right now building real economic, social, or political power? If it is not, I'm not saying you shouldn't utilize that other voice, but understand that that is a social moment. Enjoy that social movement, but do not confuse it with the organizing that is needed in this moment. 2, it is time to review our toolboxes. And from toolboxes, I mean the language we use, the acronyms that we love, right? The strategies that we undertake as if nothing has changed, right? So I'll talk to people, I've talked to heads of organizations and board members and others, and they'll agree with me, they'll say, Eric, everything has changed. I'm glad to hear someone else say that, they'll say to me. And then I'll ask them, so how's it going at your organization? And they'll say, well, we're still doing, we're taking on the same thing we were taking on 5 years ago, right? We're still trying to get these things done. Now, that may be the right thing, but what it tells me is that they likely have not sat down and thought through what should we be doing in this moment? What is most relevant? For me, I thought about it leading up to the elections. And then when the elections came out the way that I thought they would, I had actually thought that in that moment, I was not going to spend my time in philanthropy, that I was going to be in the field. And by coming back to the field, I wanted to come back to a place that actually had defeated white nationalism before, and that was the Pacific Northwest in the Mountain States. In the 90s, people in this region, city leaders, activists, liberals, conservative farmers, almost everyone you could think of, artists, I can go on and on, but you get the point, stood up, banded together to draw a moral barrier against hate. We learned lessons, we cut our teeth in ways that our nation is desperate for, in ways that our nation has never experienced. And we still sit here and get mad at the rest of the nation because they think of us as flyover country. We still sit here and say, poor us for being ignored by the rest of the nation. But it is time for us in these regions to step up and lead. The rest of the nation needs our wisdom and our experience. We do not do that if our organizations are not prepared to step up and lead in this moment. And we do not lead by continuing to simply do what we did in the past, because that's what we did. So voice, shifting our toolboxes, and the third is this. We are very courageous when we are amongst ourselves. We are less courageous when we are actually sitting in America. And it is understandable why we built our subculture. But the fact of the matter is that it's time for us to step up, and it is time for us to step out. This nest can no longer contain us. It is falling apart. And stepping up and stepping out means that you may piss off folks in this room because you are experimenting and strategizing with things that they may not understand. But if you're not experimenting and strategizing with new folks, right? New potential leaders, you're still in the nest. And stepping up and stepping out means engaging in real-world politics with all the complexities, the nuances that come with it. You're going to take your lumps out there. It is not a pleasant world in real America. I read a recent poll that said, I can't remember the exact numbers, but the number of Trump voters who love talking to their liberal friends about politics is something like 80-something%. They love it. Hillary supporters, when asked if they, how much they love that, only 30-something% said they did, that they could stand it, right? That tells me a little bit about how uncourageous we are in our conversations. Our inability to hold our values over the desire to be liked. It is not our job to be liked as leaders and activists and organizers. It is our job to come to the defense of those who are most vulnerable and marginalized in our society. Whether the call is Black Lives Matters, whether where it is water is life, whether it is 1 million rising, whether it is not one more, hashtag, me too, hashtag, what we are saying is that we seek room to breathe for all of our neighbors. And this we are unwilling to compromise on. Understand this. It is our courage that will see us through this moment. It will be our willingness to believe that we have the power to shift society if we choose. We will survive this moment by putting forth a new vision of what we believe society should be. We ultimately must understand that in this moment, our silence only makes us complicit. There is no progressive movement in this country unless that progressive movement centers the defeat of all that Trump has built in this moment. When I was a kid, we used to play a game, and we were poor kids, so we used to play a lot of games, but this was like the August game, because it would be usually a couple weeks before school started, and we had run out of everything. And so typically you find us on the porch in very hot weather, and we used to call this game If I Were. I don't know, you may have played this game, or you may have heard me talk about this. So If I Were was this simple. We'd be sitting there in a circle, and we'd say things like, if I were in the middle of the lion's cage because I had accidentally fallen in, I would have, right? Or if a flood came down the street, right? I would have. And one time someone said, if I were in the midst of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, I would have. Now, there was a lot of bravado about things we would have or would not have done, right? Or what we would have allowed or wouldn't have allowed. As kids, we're prone to that. But the question has haunted me forever. And it may have haunted many of you who have never played that game. What would you have done in the midst of the civil rights movement? Well, I can leave you with this, that we are in a moment now where you no longer have to wonder the answer to that question. I'm going to make it plain. And I'm going to make it plain because this is my community, and these are the folks that I will be working with to build a better society. Whatever it is that you would have done in the midst of the civil rights movement in 1960 is whatever it is that you do when you walk out of this door today. Make it count. History will judge you. Thank you. Thank you, my friend.